What's up guys, Ryan from Cortex Labs, livecortex.com, where we talk about performance enhancement using nootropics, peptides, research chemicals, testosterone enhancement, whatever we have available to us to make us function and feel awesome. Thanks so much for being with me. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Hit the bell to get notified of all of the content that yours truly is putting out. Check us out at livecortex.com, where we sell nootropic products primarily that I have built. These are comparable to pharmaceutical stimulants. Number one is Cortex. You can find that at livecortex.com. Please bookmark it. The links are in the description below. Number two is Torque. I'll describe them more at the end of this video if you're interested in buying very powerful nootropic stacks. Okay, so let's talk about PT-141. So what is it? It is an injectable peptide for the most part. I mean, there's a nasal spray version of it, but the anecdotal say it's not as effective. That is used primarily for stimulating erections in men. Now, that's not what it was initially used for, or studied for at least. You know, in the beginning study, it was actually an attempt to induce artificial tanning. So it was a pigmentation strategy, right? Because of what it's doing, and we'll get to that in just a second. But what the researchers found is that it actually stimulated like persistent, sustained erections in the male subjects that were having the peptide administered. And I'll get to why it's an interaction with the dopaminergic system in a minute here. PT-141 is an injectable peptide that requires bacteriostatic water, what should probably be insulin pens or insulin syringes to use it, and at least a baseline level of protein and peptide mixing and math. And I'm going to give you some tools to understand how to do that here in a bit. The dose range is between 0.5 and 3 milligrams, okay? 0.5 and 3 milligrams, with most people finding a sweet spot at 1 to 2 milligrams. Now look, most people inject this subcutaneously, so in the belly fat, just under the first layer of skin. Okay, then your body kind of sort of slowly uptakes the agent and it kind of gets into your bloodstream that way. That's what I did when I used it, sub-Q belly fat. And look, I had some insane results with it, and I'm going to get to that. But I just want to say first that this is an extremely serious compound, okay, which does come with side effects, or can come with side effects, through what I'm positive is dopaminergic neuron stimulation and release. So this is where it gets super interesting, and I'm going to break that down in a bit, but let's quickly talk about the side effects. Side effects include nausea, muscle cramps, overstimulation, anxiety, and a few miscellaneous others. And again, I'm going to circle back to that here in a bit. Mechanism of action. PT-141 is a melanocortin receptor agonist. Okay, melanocortin receptor agonist. It's specifically MC3 and MC4. Now again, what they have to do with, at least primarily, is skin pigmentation. But what PT-141 does is bind to the melanocortin receptors in the hypothalamus, and that ends up being directly erectogenic. So it stimulates erections in men and puts you in a place where both your libido is super high and you can get erections on demand, and I'm going to explain why that is. So people think it's just like an ED peptide or something. It's also for libido through its dopaminergic interplay, and I will discuss that here in a sec. But first though, I will quick say why the hypothalamus is particularly key here. Well, there's really three major things. Number one, dopaminergic activity in the hypothalamus is, you know, responsible, at least in part, but a strong part, for mental visceral libido in men, that connection between the brain and your libido. Number two, the hypothalamus is where gonadotropin production actually starts, right? First through gonadotropin releasing hormone, and then signaling to the anterior pituitary to pump out LH and FSH. And then number three, the hypothalamus is like a, you know, it's a prime target binding site for many pro-androgen or pro-sexual function drugs like SERMs, which are basically used to target the jump starting of your own testosterone after TRT, or like a steroid cycle or something to this effect. But here is the really interesting part of using PT-141. If you look at the action of the MC3 and the MC4 receptors, which again is what PT-141 agonizes, they have a deep interplay with dopaminergic neurons. So here's a paper called Melanocortin 3 Receptor Signaling in Midbrain Dopamine Neurons Increases the Motivation for Food Reward, in which they gave these, I think it was rats or mice, an MC3 agonist, so one of these receptors, one of the melanocortin receptors, and this agonist was called YMSH. And I'll read the relevant part of the study that sort of explains what I'm about to tell you. Furthermore, ex vivo electrophysiological recordings showed increased VTA, dopaminergic neuronal activity, upon YMSH application. The VTA, for the record, is the ventral tegmental area of the brain. An area of the brain, you know, like that when it's lacking dopaminergic signaling is implicated in a lot of really fucked up conditions like PSSD and other sexual dysfunction. Consistent with a dopamine-mediated effect of YMSH, the increased motivation for sucrose after intra-VTA infusion of YMSH was blocked by pre-treatment with the dopamine receptor antagonist. How do you say that? Flupenthical? So some dopamine receptor antagonist. So like we have a smoking gun right then and there, right? We've got increased ventral tegmental area dopaminergic neuron activity upon the application of an MC3 agonist. I know this isn't PT-141, but it's another MC3 agonist. So we postulate that agonizing the receptor with PT-141 is going to end up doing the same thing. And it pretty much proves that dopamine is being put into circulation here, because that effect does not happen when you put in a dopamine receptor antagonist. So look, there are a few things happening here that I want to explain to people. Number one, melanocortin receptors actually coexist in the brain with dopamine receptors in some of the same pathways. There is a phenomenon where the neurotransmitter systems interact with one another just as a byproduct of sort of being interconnected in the same pathways. This can be seen with oxytocinergic neurons, which interplay with, because of this close like anatomical relationship, with serotonergic neurons in sort of the same way, through actually expressing receptors that each system uses and can agonize. And number two, so here's where this paints the picture and makes this super clear. There are literally melanocortin receptor sites on dopaminergic neurons, which indicates that MC3 and MC4 receptors play a role in the release and in the regulation of dopamine. And what it looks like is happening in the case of PT-141 is an enhanced release of dopamine in the hypothalamus, and thus triggering on-demand erections and libido. If you want to learn more about this interaction, like for yourself, if you're just like super into it, I would look at the paper called Neurobiology of Bremelanotide, which is the other drug name for PT-141, for the treatment of hypoactive sexual desire disorder in premenopausal women, where it describes animal studies suggest that PT-141 or bremelanotide may affect female sexual desire by activating presynaptic melanocortin 4 receptors on neurons in the MPOA of the hypothalamus, leading to increased release of dopamine, an excitatory neurotransmitter that increases sexual desire. So we literally in that paper have we had one in the previous one, but we have a smoking gun of dopamine release induced by PT-141. I mean, this is fucking crazy, because a lot of folks just thought it was an erectogenic peptide, that's it, right? And then looking at melanocortin receptors, and it's like nobody really went any further than that as far as what it actually does. I took it a step further to understand fully what the melanocortin receptors do, MC3 and MC4 specifically, and yeah, they're forcing dopamine release in the hypothalamus. And what seems clear is that this is why there's not only erectogenic activity, but in the anecdotals on Reddit and in my experience with it, which I'm going to get to, people report dramatically enhanced, almost superficially sort of induced libido, like a libido that's kind of out of this world. It's not ordinary. You wouldn't ordinarily have this libido. It's like overpowered. People also report lower refractory periods when using it, extremely lower. The refractory period, by the way, is the period after, as a guy, you ejaculate, where you're not interested in sex. You know, when you ejaculate, you're kind of just not interested thereafter, like everything shuts down and you're just, sometimes you have regret depending on the situation that you're in. And you're just not interested in sex, and that may last a long period. That's because after you ejaculate, a hormone called prolactin surges, and prolactin is really the primary hormone that shuts off the sexual function and response. It inhibits erections, and it inhibits your libido. I mean, that's what prolactin is for. And as an aside, those of you that have, I wouldn't say on the high end of the reference range, but like troublingly above the reference range prolactin, that is almost definitely fussing with your sexual function. And dopamine, okay, dopamine, if you did not know this or understand this, is really the primary chemical in the human body that prevents prolactin release, right? It literally at the hypothalamus level prevents prolactin stimulation and release. In fact, dopamine itself is actually referred to in the literature somewhat scantily, like not very often, but it is referred to as they call it the prolactin inhibiting hormone. They literally call dopamine in the medical literature prolactin inhibiting hormone. So let's talk about some anecdotals here. And I'll start with this one, my experience with PT-141. I really don't like being punctured. So I'll go ahead and say that injecting it is the biggest downside. It works great, but I don't know how often I'd be willing to stab myself. At first, I felt sick and weak. I was gonna go on a run, but instead I laid down for 30 minutes and then I started to feel the libido effects. It's hard to describe this horny feeling because it's so different from other drugs that I use. With Viagra, everything is the same as being sober, except your dick stays hard. PT-141 is like the butter in a gourmet dish. Everything feels richer. The friction of my underwear was enough to get me hard, which is weird because I wouldn't say it made my dick more sensitive, but made faint sensations more pleasurable. He goes on to say like getting hard was super easy. And yeah, never have I had like this sort of erectogenic response or libido response. So second anecdotal, this one gets kind of like XXX. I mean, not that that one didn't, so I'll just sort of cut it off at a certain point, but just to give you an idea. This one's called My First PT-141 Experience, and it was seriously wow. It goes, I've tried everything for sexual enhancement, but PT-141 was by far and away the best. I'll write up the timeline. Mixed up PT-141, 10 milligrams with 1 milligram of bacteriostatic water using a 1 milliliter syringe. It dissolved instantly. At 3 p.m., I injected 2.25 milligrams into my stomach fat using an insulin needle. So that's what I would use as well as an insulin syringe. That's what I ended up using. Pain was a 1 to 10 because it really doesn't hurt when you're injecting subcutaneously with an insulin pen. Non-event. I read about a lot of nausea, so I didn't eat before, and I took an antihistamine tablet at the same time as the injection. By 5 p.m., this is the important part I want you folks to recognize, because again, not just erectogenic, but libido enhancing and strongly. By 5 p.m., I was horny as hell and had no nausea, so I did a second injection of 0.75 milligrams. I mean, I don't necessarily suggest that, but I guess this guy was getting a little aggressive. And yeah, well, let's just leave it at there, because after that he talks about some stuff that's probably a little XXX or whatever for YouTube and for this channel. So like, case in point, right? I mean, the stuff is very powerful. It is not just erectogenic, meaning that it will stimulate erections, but it should turn on your libido via the melanocortin receptors' direct interplay with dopamine release, particularly in the hypothalamus. Very, very interesting shit. Here's where we get into some theoretical ideas for helping restore dopaminergic tone and function, but I need to make this super clear. This is strictly theoretical. So what I'm about to say in the rabbit hole I'm going to quickly go down before I talk about my experience with it is theoretical, okay? And before using PT-141, you should definitely exhaust all other resources, like if you're trying to target dopaminergic system restoration particularly, and especially compounds like 9-MEBC, which we know restores dopaminergic function at some capacity for some people. Ongoing use of P5P, N-acetylcysteine, perhaps strategic mucuna usage paired with CDP choline. Those are just some strategies to regulate dopamine and get it firing better. You would probably want to execute those first before you would try using like PT-141 to try to restore dopaminergic function. But if through agonizing the melanocortin receptors, one can provoke dopaminergic release, which we've proven you can with PT-141. Libido, reward, motivation, and pleasure in people that's dopaminergic system is like downed and suboptimal in terms of functionality. And that person can then get conclusive validation that the dopaminergic system is what they need to target to feel better, then that's a good thing. Right? You're essentially using PT-141 to validate the notion that dopamine is a big problem for you. If you have anhedonia, if you've got sexual dysfunction and you've pretty much exhausted all resources, particularly for folks that have sexual dysfunction and have gone on TRT, you got your total test up to like 1,000, your free test above the reference range, E2 in some reasonable range or something, but still you're having erection problems or libido issues, like you would be a good candidate to then use PT-141 to stimulate, very directly dopaminergic release and function. And if you got libido back and you got erections and you felt great and you felt normal again, then that would confirm that dopamine needs work. That's what's really important. I mean, maybe this chemical is more of, for some people, sort of a diagnostic peptide to use to determine if you've got dopaminergic issues. Because if you take it, libido turns on and erections turn on and you feel pleasure for things, then and you don't normally feel those things and you have deficiencies in those areas, then dopamine is certainly an issue and you've got to work on it. Like PT-141 may itself not be the answer for such a person, but it could help regulate the dopaminergic system. That's my theory at this point. Again, that theory is untested. So patrol those fucking murky waters with a rifle. Be super careful if that's the approach that you're going to want to take. And remember, dopamine agonists, which I'm not really saying PT-141 is, but in an indirect way it is, because it's going to stimulate dopamine release. That dopamine is going to agonize receptor sites. Dopamine agonized and otherwise powerfully facilitating dopamine release chemicals can lead to nausea. Okay, that's the primary negative outcome. And some other nasty symptoms. So please read up on that, understand it, be careful, and keep that in mind. So that is a perfect segue, right? I went all doom and gloom on you guys for a second, to my experience. So let me just kind of break down my experience with PT-141. So I snagged a couple 10 milligram vials of PT-141, and again, I just hadn't been interested in trying it for the longest time. I was finally all right, whatever. Somebody convinced me to do it, basically told me about this experience. You got to try this, you got to see. Maybe you could do a review on a channel. And so I got some. I mixed 2 milliliters of bacteriostatic water, and I used an insulin pen, an insulin syringe. Now, I used a peptide calculator. You can find that at peptidecalc.com. It's actually a really useful tool for stuff like this, peptidecalc.com. And an insulin pen to inject this. It's an insulin needle syringe. The needle itself is a very high gauge, which means it's very small, and you literally just don't feel insulin pins for the most part, so there's next to no pain. Now look, I'm a careful dude. I'm a super careful dude with stuff like this, with anything. Even though I'm the guy that's been experimenting with peptides, nootropics, research chemicals, etc. for going on 16 years. That has taught me to be very careful when doing new things. So I started with 0.25 milligrams. With that dose, I had no side effects, so I had no nausea, no weirdness, just nothing at all. I had a mild libido boost, but it was definitely noticeable. I was like, wow, I'm interested. I'm in I'm in the mood here. And then I had good, sustainable erection quality for what was probably, I want to say 6 or 7 hours or something, that night. And that was pretty much it. No other weird side effects. I went to sleep. I woke up the next day, didn't really notice much, and that kind of just went on with my life. So then, I think it was a few days later, because you want to give this stuff a few days to get out of your system for sure, I went to 0.5 milligrams. So at 0.5 milligrams, which is, higher dose, it's still a conservative dose, though, all things considered, I had slight facial flushing, so it's it seemed like some blood flow was entering my face, maybe some vasodilation in my brain, in my head, because my face looked noticeably red, and that's a side effect that people do get. I mean, it wasn't uncomfortable or anything. It was somewhat comparable to a niacin flush, if you've ever had that, but without the itchiness or the burning. And I did have nausea that lasted about 30 minutes. So for about 30 minutes, I was my stomach felt a little weird. I basically felt nauseous for 30 minutes, but it wasn't strong. It was just noticeable. I wasn't going to throw up, but I was I don't really feel great. Then I may have been an hour or so after the injection, I had a noticeable libido increase. I mean, now we're talking about very, very marked libido increase. and a very, very strong, pretty much on-demand sustained erection for, again, 6 to 8 hours or something. It was like, for that time period, I was getting into the territory of wanting to go hunting for girls, like showing up at fucking hotel bars and shit and finding women at the bars. And we'll get to what eventually happened, because I actually dosed it higher than that on my next experimentation. So my final experimentation where I kind of found the dose that really is, I'm sort of still unsure about dose for me, but it's a really strong dose for me particularly, was 1 milligram, okay? 1 milligrams of PT-141. That lands me, so basically what I figured out is 1 milligram is the amount that I need to take for like extreme arousal and extreme sexual function and extremely sustainable, streamlined, persistent, on-demand erections, 1 milligram. With that, I had extreme nausea to the point where I was like, pretty sure I'm going to throw up. I ended up not throwing up, but I was like pretty sure that was going to happen, and I was okay with it and whatever. That lasted about 20 minutes. Then I had some tolerable nausea that was still pretty extreme, but not as bad. For another 20 minutes, I had extreme facial flushing on this 1 milligram dose for about 30 minutes. And then, my friends, the most superficial, non-normal, powerful libido I've had perhaps almost ever. I mean, with the exception of like maybe when I was 13 or 15 or 16, like when I was a teenager. And of course, insane erections that, I don't know, lasted 10 hours, like all through the night. And then the next day, like, for half of the day, like it was pretty fucking intense, man. So I want to warn you in this situation, like if you find a dose that's very potent for you with PT-141, this is a situation in which you're gonna have to, or at least you should plan to have sex. Like you should have your girlfriend or partner or wife or whatever, whoever, around, like, or have some outlet at some capacity, even if it's yourself, because you're going to want to climax. You're gonna want to have sex or climax. It's if you find the right dose, it will kind of make you crazy and sort of have to, seek that release and climax. To get back into kind of, going on the prowl, I literally ended up at a few hotels in downtown Pittsburgh hunting. This is not like me. I will not show up at a hotel where there may be women and go to the bar and prowl for women. It's not something that I do often or whatever. It's not like a thought that would come in my head and be like, you should do that tonight. What are we gonna do tonight? Let's go prowl for women in a fucking hotel. But that's where I ended up. That's where I ended up at a few hotel bars, like on the hunt for women. I haven't felt like that in a long time, like being that sexually aroused and actually being like a fucking predator. It was like, it was a very interesting experience. And suffice it to say, I ended up having a really, really interesting night. I'll just couch it there though for you guys. So be warned. Okay, have a plan, have a partner, have something set up so that you can release and climax if you need to, if it gets to that point. And that is my experience and the full breakdown of the dopaminergic stuff related to PT-141. Remember guys, be safe in sourcing. No source talk in the comments for the record when it comes to peptides. We just want to be super careful. YouTube has taken our channel down for just weird things in the past. We don't want to be talking about that, in the comments. I can say that a popular nootropic source out there, it does have PT-141, so that may be something for you folks to look into. And again, I guess I think the most overarching point that I want to get across to you guys is just be careful with it, right? Do not dose it frequently. If you want to experiment with it, fine. Be aware that first you're going to need to understand how to mix bacteriostatic water with peptides and do subcutaneous injections, and all that stuff can be found on the web. And then secondly, be aware that more than likely, at a certain dose, you're going to get side effects with it, like nausea and facial flushing. It's really not a huge deal or whatever, but it does happen for pretty much most people that get a somewhat high dose of PT-141 in their system. And then also be prepared, to have some pretty insane sexual function. Remember that the melanocortin receptors, agonizing them, MC3 and MC4, stimulates dopaminergic release, dopamine firing from the hypothalamus, right? And that may, for some of you that have dopamine issues and have no pleasure, have anhedonia, cannot function sexually. It may give you validation that dopamine needs to be worked on, at least in part, to help you resolve your issue. If anything that people get out of this, I want it to be that. Otherwise, experiment wisely, have fun. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for being with me. Go support us, livecortex.com. So let's talk about our nootropic stacks. Number one, the Cortex stack. Strong, clean stimulant. I mean, this stuff is powerful. Initially built for entrepreneurs. Like, I built a stack in Cortex for productive, hard-charging individuals, right? If you just want to take a nootropic stack and it puts you in that place where your brain is super fluid, you have energy, you have motivation, you're verbally fluent, you're just kind of in that place where it's easier to work. That's what the Cortex stack is for. Buy the stack at livecortex.com. Number two, the Torque nootropic stack. Pretty new, but this one is like not for the faint of heart. Torque is like comparable to a pharmaceutical stimulant, honestly. It is a clean, stimulating nootropic stack that pumps up brain energy and really puts you in that space to like be a beast to get things done. Like, we've all been there where we have that crazy great brain energy to target stuff. Torque is a way of artificially inducing that, where you just turn on brain energy, get yourself into the place where you want to do work, and you just become basically a beast. Get Torque at livecortex.com. Get the Torque nootropic stack, livecortex.com. The links are in the description below for all of our products, including consulting. If you need me to consult you on testosterone enhancement, libido enhancement, nootropics usage, anything else in between, including things like PSSD, please check out the consulting options at livecortex.com and either book a call with me or get on some sort of ongoing consulting program. But the primary two products I think you guys are really going to love if you haven't bought any of our products would be Cortex and Torque. These are very powerful stimulant nootropic stacks. Go get them, livecortex.com. Thank you so much for being with me, everybody. It's been a pleasure hanging out with you. I will chat with you very soon. Talk to you next time.